In 1985, a science fiction horror film opened in theaters carrying a story audiences did not fully understand. Somewhere between London and Los Angeles, in editing rooms most viewers never knew existed, its meaning changed. Scenes disappeared. A voice was added to explain what images had once explained alone. For decades, two very different versions of this film circulated in different countries, and almost no one noticed. This is the story of Lifeforce, and the version most audiences never saw. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight we are opening a case file from the mid-1980s, a big-budget science fiction production that arrived in theaters changed from what its director intended. We will follow the evidence, from an obscure British novel to a studio editing room, and ask what was really lost along the way. Lifeforce was released in 1985, directed by Tobe Hooper, fresh off two very different projects, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. On paper, it looked like a prestige gamble, a $25 million production from Cannon Films, the independent studio run by Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, known more for low-budget action pictures than effects-driven space epics. The question that still lingers among collectors and film historians is simple. Which version of Lifeforce actually represents what Hooper set out to make? 3. You first have to understand where the story came from. Lifeforce was based on The Space Vampires, a 1976 novel by Colin Wilson, a British writer better known for philosophical and occult nonfiction than pulp science fiction. Wilson's book was dense, cerebral, and unapologetically strange, following a crew that discovers ancient dormant beings aboard a derelict spacecraft hidden inside Halley's Comet. The screenplay adaptation was handed to Dan O'Bannon, the writer behind Alien, working alongside Don Jacoby. Their script kept the bones of Wilson's concept, but pushed it toward apocalyptic spectacle, imagining a London slowly consumed by a mysterious plague of energy-draining beings. Cannon Films rarely spent this kind of money. According to accounts from people involved in the production, Golan and Globus saw Lifeforce as their ticket into the mainstream, a film that could compete with the science fiction blockbusters of the era. Tobe Hooper, for his part, reportedly wanted something closer to a serious, unsettling epic, using imaginative imagery to explore themes of possession, obsession, and the fragility of identity. That gap, between a studio chasing a broad commercial hit and a director chasing something stranger and more personal, sits at the center of everything that happened next. Production was difficult almost from the start. Filming took place across England, using Pinewood and Elstree studios, along with British locations standing in for a devastated London. Visual effects supervision came from John Dykstra, whose team had worked on Star Wars, and the production leaned heavily on miniature work, matte paintings, and practical effects that were expensive and time-consuming to execute correctly. Schedule pressure mounted as the effects work fell behind, and Cannon's famously tight budgets meant there was little room for delay. Casting brought its own complications. Steve Railsback took the lead role of Colonel Tom Carlson, with Peter Firth playing British intelligence officer Colin Kane, and a young Patrick Stewart, appearing as the head of a psychiatric hospital central to the film's most intense sequences. The role of the alien space vampire went to French actress Mathilda May, largely unknown to American audiences at the time, in a performance built as much around striking physical presence as dialogue. Her casting would later shape how the studio chose to market the finished film, in ways Hooper had not necessarily intended. Behind the camera, Hooper was working with editor John Grover, whose task was to shape hundreds of hours of footage into something coherent. According to accounts from people connected to the production, Hooper's early assembly of the film ran considerably longer than any version that eventually reached audiences, closer to a rough work print than a finished theatrical cut. That work print reportedly contained additional character material and slower, more meditative passages that later disappeared as the film moved toward its release deadline. Whether a complete copy of that early assembly still exists in any archive has never been confirmed publicly. Cannon's financial structure added its own pressure. The studio often pre-sold foreign distribution rights to films before they were finished, using that money to fund production, which meant Lifeforce needed to satisfy distributors in multiple territories before a single frame had been locked. Some historians argue this international financing arrangement is part of why a longer cut survived for European release, even as American distributors pushed for something shorter and simpler. The original screenplay leaned into ambiguity. Wilson's novel and the O'Bannon and Jacoby script that followed it treated the vampiric threat as something closer to a psychic and spiritual contagion than a simple monster story. Much of the suspense came from suggestion, from characters slowly losing their sense of self as the life force drained from London's population. Hooper reportedly wanted audiences to feel disoriented, to experience the collapse of reality alongside the characters, rather than have every plot mechanic explained to them directly. But something was missing from the version that eventually reached most American theaters. When Lifeforce was finished, two significantly different cuts existed. Cannon and its European partners released a longer version in the United Kingdom, running close to 128 minutes, closer to Hooper's original assembly. TriStar Pictures, distributing the film in the United States, released a shorter theatrical cut, running around 101 minutes. The difference was not simply a matter of trimming for pacing. According to multiple accounts from those who have studied both versions, the American cut removed several scenes of character development and expanded exposition, then added something the international version never had at all: a voiceover narration. The narration, delivered by Railsback's character, was reportedly inserted after test screenings left American audiences confused about the plot. Rather than trust the visual storytelling that Hooper and his editors had constructed, the U.S. distributor apparently opted to have Carlson explain key plot developments directly to the audience. Whole passages of ambiguity, moments where viewers were meant to piece events together themselves, were replaced with a voice telling them exactly what to think. What audiences never saw in American theaters were entire connective scenes that gave the story room to breathe. The longer international cut includes extended sequences aboard the derelict spacecraft found near Halley's Comet, additional material establishing the relationship between Carlson and the alien woman, and expanded scenes inside Patrick Stewart's asylum sequence, widely regarded by fans as one of the film's most unsettling passages. Several of these scenes still exist and survive intact on the surviving negative elements used for the international version, which is part of why later home video restorations were able to include them. Among the most discussed missing material are extended character beats surrounding Colonel Kane, Peter Firth's investigator, whose growing suspicion and unraveling composure play out more gradually in the longer cut. In the shortened American version, several of these connective moments were removed, compressing his arc into a series of quicker plot beats rather than a slow psychological erosion. Fans who have compared the two versions frame by frame often point to this thread specifically as the clearest example of a character losing dimension once the footage was trimmed. There is also the matter of the film's opening act. The international cut spends noticeably more time establishing the space shuttle Churchill's discovery of the derelict alien vessel before the story shifts to London, giving the crew and their eventual fates more weight once the crisis begins. Shortened for American audiences, this section moves faster, sacrificing some of the dread that comes from watching characters slowly realize what they have found. Production stills, early publicity photographs, and the film's own trailer preserve glimpses of shots and moments that appear only briefly, or not at all, in the U.S. theatrical cut, offering visual evidence of material that did make it in front of cameras even where screen time was later reduced. The psychological cost of these cuts is where the mystery becomes genuinely interesting. In the longer version, Carlson's descent into obsession unfolds gradually. His connection to the alien woman, built through repeated, lingering encounters that blur the line between fascination and possession. Trimmed down and narrated for American audiences, that same descent becomes something closer to a plot point being announced rather than experienced. Removing the space, removing the silence, removing the audience's own work of interpretation changed the emotional texture of the film considerably. This is where the psychological cost becomes measurable in more than just running time. In the longer cut, Carlson's moral position stays genuinely uncertain for much of the film. An astronaut who may be complicit in the disaster unfolding around him, whose sympathy for the alien woman blurs into something the audience is never quite allowed to fully trust. The narration added for American theaters resolves some of that uncertainty by simply telling viewers what Carlson is thinking, collapsing ambiguity that the original cut had left open. Moral ambiguity, once one of the film's most distinctive qualities, becomes something closer to conventional exposition. The same shift affects how audiences experience the film's supporting characters. Peter Firth's Kane, stripped of some of his connective scenes, reads as more purely functional in the American cut, an investigator moving the plot forward rather than a man whose own composure is quietly disintegrating. Patrick Stewart's asylum sequence, trimmed in places, loses some of the slow unease that made the longer version's psychiatric scenes so unsettling to fans who eventually saw both cuts side by side. None of these changes rewrite the plot outright. They simply remove the emotional runway the film originally gave itself, and that absence changes how the story feels even when the events on screen remain technically the same. According to accounts from people who worked on the effects and post-production side, the US cut also altered the film's sound. Composer Henry Mancini, an unusual choice for a genre film given his background in orchestral and jazz scoring, had written original music for Lifeforce. Reports from those who have compared the versions describe certain sequences in the American theatrical cut using library or replacement cues in place of Mancini's original material, apparently done to fit the tightened runtime and altered pacing. The exact extent of this remains a point some historians still debate, since studio paperwork from Cannon's post-production process has never been fully published. Mancini himself was an unusual fit for a project like this, better known for lighter, more melodic scores, and some critics at the time noted that his music sat oddly against the film's darker imagery, even before any post-production tinkering took place. Whether the altered cues in the American cut represent a deliberate creative choice, a rushed technical fix to match new scene lengths, or some combination of both, is not something surviving records settle definitively. What can be said is that audiences hearing the American theatrical cut and audiences hearing the international cut were not always listening to quite the same film, in addition to watching a different one. Marketing added another layer to the story. Cannon and TriStar's advertising for Lifeforce leaned heavily on the film's provocative visual elements rather than its science fiction ideas, a choice that shaped audience expectations before anyone bought a ticket. Viewers walked in anticipating something closer to a mature thriller, and instead received a dense, apocalyptic science fiction story with philosophical ambitions. That mismatch between marketing and content is frequently cited by critics and historians as one reason the American release struggled at the box office, regardless of which cut audiences happened to see. The released version concealed an important part of the story's intended shape. Test audiences, unfamiliar with the source material and confused by the film's more abstract passages, reportedly responded poorly during preview screenings. Rather than trust the material to find its audience, the American distributor moved towards simplification, adding narration and trimming scenes that required patience rather than explanation. This kind of intervention was common in the 1980s, when studios frequently used test screenings to justify aggressive recuts of ambitious genre films. Not every change can be blamed on the studio alone. Some trims were reportedly made for pacing reasons that even Hooper and his editors agreed with, tightening sequences that dragged in early assemblies. Distinguishing between necessary editorial tightening and commercially motivated interference is difficult this many decades later, and accounts from participants have not always agreed. What is documented is that the addition of narration was a distributor decision made after the film was largely complete, layered on top of an existing cut rather than woven into the original editorial process. It is worth being fair to everyone involved in that decision. TriStar was not simply trying to sabotage an ambitious film for the sake of it. Distributors in the mid-1980s frequently relied on test screenings as their primary tool for predicting box office performance, and a confused test audience represented a genuine commercial risk on a film that had already cost $25 million to produce. From a distributor's perspective, adding narration was a relatively low-cost way to protect that investment compared to reshoots or a full re-edit. From a director's perspective, that same narration undercut years of careful visual storytelling. Both positions were rational given what each side was responsible for, even though they pulled the finished film in opposite directions. For years, the longer international version was difficult for American audiences to see at all. It circulated primarily through British television broadcasts, European home video releases, and imported laserdiscs and DVDs, while American releases largely reflected the shorter, narrated theatrical cut. Fans who wanted to compare the two often had to rely on imported copies or secondhand accounts describing scenes that simply were not available domestically. That began to change with a series of home video releases over the following decades. Early DVD editions in various territories offered inconsistent versions, sometimes labeling cuts incorrectly or combining elements from different sources. Television broadcasts added further confusion, since certain American TV airings used the shorter narrated cut, sometimes further edited for content and time slots, while broadcasts elsewhere in the world occasionally used prints closer to the longer international version. Viewers taping the film off television in different countries during the 80s and 90s, without realizing it, were often preserving meaningfully different artifacts of the same production. It was not until Scream Factory's 2013 Blu-ray release in the United States that both the theatrical cut and the longer international cut were made available together, properly identified and sourced from surviving film elements. For the first time, American audiences could directly compare the narrated, shortened theatrical version against the longer cut closer to what British audiences had known for decades. Film preservation enthusiasts and online communities had already spent years cataloging the differences between prior releases, cross-referencing running times, narration presence, and scene order long before an official dual-cut release existed, effectively acting as amateur archivists for a film the major studios had left in a confusing state for nearly 3 decades. This release answered some long-standing questions while leaving others open. It confirmed definitively that the international cut restored substantial character material absent from the American theatrical version, and that the added narration was exclusive to the U.S. cut, rather than an alternate interpretation someone had assembled after the fact. What it did not resolve is whether either surviving cut fully represents Hooper's original vision. Hooper himself, in interviews given later in his career, generally described the international version as closer to what he intended, while still acknowledging that even that cut had passed through further studio and distributor hands before release. The fate of any additional deleted material remains uncertain. There is no confirmed public record of a complete, unedited work print surviving beyond the elements used for the 128-minute international cut. Some collectors and historians have speculated that additional trims exist somewhere in studio vaults or private archives, but no verified footage beyond what appears in the existing releases has surfaced. Whether such material was destroyed, misplaced, or simply never fully assembled into a separate cut is not something the historical record currently answers. There has also never been an officially branded director's cut of Lifeforce, in the way some other films from this era eventually received one. Hooper did not go on to publicly campaign for a full restoration project in the years before his passing in 2017, and no studio has announced plans to attempt a ground-up reconstruction beyond assembling the surviving elements already used for the international cut. This leaves an open question that separates Lifeforce from other famous cases of studio interference. The longer version we now have access to is best understood not as a definitive restoration of a single artistic vision, but as the fullest surviving assembly of a film that may never have existed in one single, fully agreed-upon form to begin with. What he said with confidence is this: Lifeforce exists today in at least two legitimate studio-sanctioned forms, shaped by different audiences, different expectations, and different ideas about how much a science fiction horror film should explain versus how much it should leave unsaid. The shorter American cut, narrated and tightened, reflects a distributor's attempt to make an ambitious, strange film easier to sell. The longer international cut, closer to Hooper's original assembly, asks more of its audience and offers more in return, at the cost of the clarity that narration provided for nervous test screening viewers decades ago. Neither version can be dismissed as simply wrong. Both represent real decisions made by real people responding to real commercial pressures, working with a project that was, by most accounts, difficult to control from the start. Hooper wanted ambiguity. Cannon wanted a hit. TriStar wanted an audience that would not walk out confused. Somewhere between those competing goals, the film that reached most American theaters in 1985 became a compromise none of its creators fully claimed as their own. The larger mystery, then, is not simply which scenes were cut or which narration was added. It is how easily a film's meaning can shift once it leaves a director's hands, how a single distributor's note after a bad test screening can quietly reshape what millions of people believe a movie is actually about. For decades, most audiences who watched Lifeforce had no idea they were watching a compromise, not a vision. Restoration has closed part of that gap, giving modern viewers access to the version Hooper considered closer to his intentions. But even that access raises a final, harder question. When a director's original vision was already altered before the version we now call restored was locked, can any surviving cut truly claim to be definitive? Or are we simply looking at the most complete version that happened to survive? Lifeforce remains a reminder that the film history we inherit is rarely as fixed as it appears on a disc case or a streaming menu. Somewhere in the gap between a novel about ancient cosmic beings and a studio's marketing department, a story changed shape more than once without most of its audience ever noticing. Multiply this case across the hundreds of other genre films Cannon and its contemporaries rushed through test screenings and distributor notes during the 1980s, and the scale of the pattern becomes clearer. Editing rooms are rarely neutral spaces. They are where commercial pressure, artistic intention, and audience expectation collide, often in ways no single person fully controls. A director can shoot exactly the film they set out to make, and still watch a distributor reshape its meaning in the months before release, using tools as simple as a narrator's voice, reading lines that were never meant to exist. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you have seen Lifeforce, which version did you actually watch? The narrated American cut or the longer international version? And did you know at the time that a difference even existed? Let us know in the comments which cut you consider the true version of this film, and whether you think the missing material still waiting somewhere deserves a proper search.